Crimea is not just another battlefield. It is the key that could end or explode the entire Ukraine-Russia war. Control over this peninsula affects military power, global trade routes, nuclear strategy, and political survival. Today, we will break down why Crimea matters more than any other territory and how its fate could decide the final outcome of this historic conflict. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into one of the most critical questions of the Ukraine-Russia war, why Crimea could decide everything. Crimea is not just land on a map, it is a strategic nerve center linking military power, politics, and global influence. Whoever controls Crimea gains dominance over the Black Sea, controls key supply routes, and sends a powerful message to the world. Since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, it has been the emotional and strategic heart of the conflict. For Ukraine, reclaiming Crimea represents sovereignty, justice, and national survival. For Russia, losing Crimea would be a massive political humiliation and a strategic disaster. This peninsula hosts major naval bases, airfields, radar systems, and supply hubs that directly shape battlefield outcomes. Beyond military value, Crimea influences energy routes, food exports, and regional stability affecting Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Many analysts believe that if Ukraine regains Crimea, the war could rapidly shift toward resolution. Conversely, if Russia secures Crimea permanently, it could freeze the conflict on Moscow's terms. In this video series, we will break down Crimea's geography, history, military role, political symbolism, and global consequences. By the end, you will clearly understand why this single peninsula may determine not only who wins the war, but how the future security order of Europe is rewritten forever. Crimea's geographic position makes it uniquely powerful in modern warfare. Located in the Black Sea, Crimea acts like an unsinkable aircraft carrier. From this peninsula, military forces can project power across southern Ukraine, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and even parts of the Middle East. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, headquartered in Sevastopol, relies heavily on Crimea for naval dominance. Control of this fleet allows missile launches, troop transport, and maritime blockades. Ukraine understands that as long as Russia holds Crimea, Moscow can threaten Ukrainian ports, restrict grain exports, and pressure NATO's eastern flank. Geography also shapes logistics. Crimea connects to southern Ukraine through narrow land corridors and bridges, making it both valuable and vulnerable. If Ukraine disrupts supply lines to Crimea, Russian forces face isolation. This is why attacks on the Kerch Bridge and surrounding routes matter so much. Air defense systems placed in Crimea give Russia radar coverage deep into Ukrainian territory. At the same time, these systems become prime targets. In modern conflict, geography determines tempo, reach, and escalation risk. Crimea's coastline, airspace, and proximity to key shipping lanes elevate its importance far beyond its size. Simply put, no other location in this war offers the same combination of offensive reach, defensive depth, and psychological weight as Crimea does today. To understand why Crimea matters so deeply, we must look at its history. Crimea has changed hands many times over centuries, shaped by empires, wars, and shifting borders. In 1954, the Soviet Union transferred Crimea from Russia to Ukraine, a move seen as symbolic at the time. After the Soviet collapse, Crimea remained part of independent Ukraine, though Russia never fully accepted this reality. In 2014, following Ukraine's political upheaval, Russia annexed Crimea in a move condemned internationally. This annexation reshaped European security overnight. For Ukraine, Crimea became a symbol of stolen territory and violated sovereignty. For Russia, it became proof of restored power and resistance against Western influence. This historical baggage fuels today's conflict. Crimea is not just strategic, it is emotional. Leaders in Moscow have built narratives of identity and legitimacy around Crimea. Losing it would undermine years of propaganda and political justification. For Ukraine, reclaiming Crimea would mark the reversal of a decade-long injustice. History shapes public opinion, military decisions, and negotiation limits. That is why compromise over Crimea is extremely difficult. Both sides see it as non-negotiable. When territory carries historical identity, wars become longer and more dangerous. Crimea's past continues to influence every missile strike, diplomatic speech, and military gamble made today. Crimea's military value cannot be overstated. It hosts air bases capable of launching fighter jets, bombers, and drones deep into Ukraine. Missile systems stationed in Crimea can strike critical infrastructure, cities, and supply hubs hundreds of kilometers away. Russia uses Crimea as a launchpad for operations across southern Ukraine, including Kherson and Zaporizhia. Naval forces based in Sevastopol control sea lanes and enforce blockades. This has directly affected global grain markets and food security. Ukraine's strategy increasingly focuses on weakening Crimea without full-scale invasion. Precision strikes, drone attacks, and sabotage operations aim to degrade Russian capabilities. Every destroyed radar, ship, or depot reduces Moscow's ability to dominate the region. Crimea also plays a defensive role. It shields Russia's southern flank and secures access to warm water ports. If Ukraine regains Crimea, Russia's entire southern military posture collapses. Supply lines would be exposed, naval dominance lost, and regional deterrence shattered. That is why Russia invests heavily in air defenses and fortifications there. Crimea is the anchor holding Russia's southern war effort together. Remove that anchor, and the entire structure becomes unstable. This makes Crimea not just a battlefield, but the backbone of Russia's military strategy in Ukraine. Politically, Crimea is a red line for both sides. For the Kremlin, Crimea represents legitimacy, strength, and national pride. Russian leadership has tied its credibility to holding Crimea at all costs. Losing it could trigger domestic unrest, elite fractures, and questions about leadership competence. For Ukraine, any peace deal that leaves Crimea under Russian control risks political collapse. Ukrainian society overwhelmingly sees Crimea as occupied territory. Leaders who compromise on it could lose public support instantly. This political deadlock makes Crimea the hardest issue in any negotiation. Internationally, Crimea influences alliance unity. NATO and the European Union refuse to recognize Russia's annexation, reinforcing principles of sovereignty. How Crimea's fate is resolved will set precedents for future conflicts worldwide. If borders can be changed by force, global stability weakens. That is why Western support to Ukraine often includes long-term commitment tied to territorial integrity. Crimea also affects sanctions policy, diplomatic isolation, and global narratives. Control of Crimea is not just about tanks and missiles. It is about legitimacy in the international system. Whoever controls Crimea shapes the political story of this war. Aggressor or defender, victor or violator. That narrative will echo long after the fighting stops. Crimea's impact extends far beyond Ukraine and Russia. The Black Sea is a vital artery for global trade, especially food and energy. When Russia controls Crimea, it can disrupt shipping routes, raise insurance costs, and pressure global markets. We saw this during grain export crises that affected Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Control of Crimea allows leverage over millions far from the battlefield. Energy infrastructure in the region also matters. Pipelines, ports, and undersea cables connect economies. Any instability around Crimea raises energy prices and geopolitical tensions. NATO countries closely monitor Crimea because of its proximity to alliance borders. Missile deployments there shorten warning times and increase escalation risks. This raises concerns about miscalculation and wider war. Turkey, a key Black Sea power, balances carefully due to Crimea's strategic importance. Even China watches closely, as outcomes influence how territorial disputes are handled globally. Crimea has become a test case for international law enforcement. If Ukraine retakes Crimea with Western support, it reinforces deterrence against aggression. If Russia holds it, other powers may feel emboldened. Thus, Crimea's fate will influence not only this war, but future conflicts worldwide. From Ukraine's perspective, retaking Crimea is extremely challenging, but strategically transformative. A direct assault would be costly, so Ukraine focuses on isolating the peninsula. By targeting supply lines, bridges, and bases, Ukraine aims to make Crimea militarily unsustainable. This strategy avoids massive casualties while steadily weakening Russian control. Psychological pressure is also key. Frequent strikes undermine the perception of safety among Russian forces and civilians relocated there. Information warfare highlights vulnerabilities and raises doubts. Ukraine also uses diplomacy to keep Crimea central in international discussions, ensuring long-term support. If Ukraine regains Crimea, it regains control of its coastline and maritime economy. Ports reopen, exports stabilize, and reconstruction becomes viable. Militarily, Russia would lose its strongest Black Sea position. This would likely force Moscow to reconsider continuing the war. However, escalation risks remain. Crimea is sensitive enough that Russia might respond unpredictably. That is why Ukraine's approach is careful, gradual, and calculated. Crimea represents the final objective rather than an early target. Its liberation would symbolize not just military success, but the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty and future security guarantees. For Russia, Crimea is both strength and vulnerability. While it provides strategic depth, it also concentrates valuable assets in one place. Ships, aircraft, and command centers clustered there become high-value targets. Modern precision weapons and drones reduce the safety once provided by distance. Russia must spend enormous resources defending Crimea, stretching air defenses and manpower. Every system deployed, there is one not available elsewhere. Politically, Crimea locks Russia into a rigid position. Backing down would appear weak, yet holding it indefinitely may be unsustainable. This creates strategic paralysis. Russia also faces logistical challenges. Supplying Crimea depends heavily on limited routes. Disruptions quickly impact readiness. The longer the war continues, the harder it becomes to justify these costs domestically. Crimea thus becomes a trap essential to hold, but increasingly expensive and risky. This dilemma shapes Russian decision-making. Any serious threat to Crimea forces Moscow to respond, raising escalation risks. That is why Crimea is often described as the most dangerous flashpoint of the war. Looking ahead, Crimea will likely determine how the war ends. If Ukraine gradually neutralizes Crimea, Russia may seek negotiations from a weaker position. If Russia stabilizes and fortifies Crimea, the conflict could freeze, leaving unresolved tensions for decades. A sudden escalation around Crimea could also widen the war. That is why international actors closely watch every development there. Diplomatic initiatives often stall because Crimea remains unresolved. Peace frameworks hinge on its status. Any security guarantees for Ukraine depend on Crimea's outcome. Reconstruction funding, sanctions relief, and political normalization all tie back to this peninsula. Crimea is not a side issue, it is the core variable. The war's endgame will revolve around it. Whether through military pressure, negotiations, or prolonged stalemate, Crimea will shape the final chapter. Understanding this helps explain why so much effort, attention, and risk centers on this relatively small piece of land. In modern geopolitics, size does not equal importance. Crimea proves that strategic location and symbolism can outweigh everything else. In conclusion, Crimea stands at the crossroads of military strategy, political legitimacy, and global stability. Its geography enables power projection, its history fuels identity conflicts, and its control shapes international norms. For Ukraine, Crimea represents justice, security, and survival. For Russia, it symbolizes strength, pride, and strategic necessity. For the world, it is a test of whether international law still matters. Every missile strike, diplomatic statement, and military plan circles back to Crimea. That is why analysts often say, whoever decides Crimea, decides the war. The peninsula's fate will influence not just borders, but future alliances, deterrence, and conflict resolution worldwide. Ignoring Crimea means misunderstanding the entire war. As events continue to unfold, watching Crimea closely offers the clearest signal of where this conflict is heading. Whether through gradual pressure or dramatic change, Crimea will remain the decisive factor. Understanding its importance helps us grasp the true stakes of this war and why its outcome matters far beyond Ukraine and Russia. If you found this breakdown valuable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep geopolitical analysis. Share this video to help others understand why Crimea truly matters.